Shalom, everybody. Rabbi Edelstein here with this week's installment of Rabbi E in 3, brought to you as always by MEOR DC. And on behalf of MEOR DC, I want to thank all of you so much for helping make our MEOR charity campaign a few weeks ago a huge success. We reached our fundraising goal locally and nationally. So many of you helped. Students came in to the room in the Marvin Center where I was making calls and posting. They helped. Many of you donated generously or sent words of encouragement or watched my little incredible song on my tennis racket, which went to the top of the charts. It's still there. Thank you so much. You help us do our mission of educating, inspiring, and empowering a new generation of college students. In fact, I was so exhausted from the fundraising campaign, I didn't do a Rabbi E in 3 last week. So I'm here this week with renewed energy. And it's a good Torah portion to talk about. It's the final Torah portion in the book of Genesis called Vayechi. We end the book of Bereshit, Genesis. Next week we begin Shmos, Exodus. And the whole theme of this Torah portion, Vayechi, indeed, is the transition into the state of Galut, exile. Right? Jacob and the whole Jewish people at that stage, the whole family of Yaakov, had come down to Egypt in last week's Torah portion, but now the shibud will begin, the slavery, the constriction will begin. And indeed, the Torah portion spatially shows that. What do I mean? Every Torah portion in a scroll, there's a space, either bigger or smaller, between the final word of the last week's Torah portion and then the next week. But not Vayechi, this week's Torah portion. It begins immediately from the previous word when you see it in the Torah scroll. As Rashi points out, it's constricted, it's hemmed in, and that reflects the spiritual reality of what the Jewish people were about to experience, especially when Jacob, the patriarch, dies, which he does after 17 years living in Egypt. As Rashi says, the hearts and the minds of the Jewish people became closed and constricted and they began to be influenced and feel the pain of the exile, which of course would become increasingly bitter and horrible, leading to the physical suffering and slavery we know about with the story of the Exodus in the next few Torah portions. Exile, whether it was in Egypt, which was the paradigm of all our future exiles as a people, or the present exile. We're still in exile, spiritually speaking, since the destruction of the Second Temple. And the Holocaust being like the nadir probably of that exile. I think of that because I'm going, God willing, to Poland this Sunday with 13 students from DC and others on a MEOR Poland trip. So I'm thinking about exile and the darkness and the suffering of exile. There's physical suffering and slavery, unimaginable pain and suffering of our ancestors in Egypt and our ancestors in Auschwitz and elsewhere. Unimaginable. But there's also spiritual darkness, confusion, the loss of hope. Maybe that's worse, because if someone and some few unique people who were able to survive Auschwitz or other times of the Holocaust, many of them, they somehow kept that flame of humanity and hope alive. That was the key to their survival. So the physical suffering of exile, horrible. The spiritual bleakness and, God forbid, despair, equally horrible. But we can find light in the darkness. We can. And you see it in this week's Torah portion. Even though it's a portion of constriction and the beginning of exile, what else is going in the portion? Jacob, Yaakov, blesses each of his children before he dies. And the blessings zoom in on the beautiful qualities of each of his children. So a beautiful idea here is how can we, in our personal lives, sometimes we go through periods of darkness, exile as it were, but to look for the good, to see the beauty in the fellow man and woman, fellow human being next to us, lift up our eyes. We should do that, to not just see God's beautiful world, but to see the beauty in people around us. I've gone over 3 minutes. I gotta work on that. I really do. But there was so much to say this week, and I give the thanks. So, the bitterness and darkness of our own personal difficulties in exile or the national exile, which we can experience and have experienced at times, our hearts and minds get closed. They can get closed, as Rashi expresses it. And it still might be dark, but there are glimmers of hope in the darkness. Always, always. May you have a Shabbos full of light and see the good in your own life, your own personality. That's sometimes really hard. I know I can speak from that sometimes. To see the goodness in others, to see the goodness in the world. Even in Auschwitz, if you read the beautiful book, Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor Frankl, famous Jewish Viennese psychiatrist, he says in Auschwitz he saw the horror, the apathy, the cruelty that took over so many people. and we understand why, but he also saw the sparks of humanity and goodness and inner spiritual freedom. In fact, it strengthened his own faith that there is something called free will. If you read the book, Man's Search for Meaning, he talks about that. So we should strengthen our faith, and I hope that the students I lead to Poland will feel that inspiration as we go through the horrors, the lows, but also the highs of the Jewish experience in Poland. Have a wonderful Shabbos. I'm very sorry I took too much of your time, but I'm not going to edit it out. I'm going to let it stay. You can turn it off, turn it on. Good Shabbos.